Arthur Nelson was 33 years old and the undisputed master of everything the eye could behold from the highest ridge of the Big Sky Valley in Montana. He was the owner of the Silver Pine Ranch, a sprawling empire of fertile soil, dense timber, and thousands of head of cattle that stretched across the rugged landscape of the American West in the late 19th century. Arthur had inherited this massive estate from his father when he was barely a man, still learning how to navigate the complexities of his own heart. Yet through sheer stubbornness and a tireless work ethic, he had transformed the ranch into the most prosperous operation in the territory. His main house sat perched upon a gentle hill, shaded by ancient towering pines, and hidden from the common view, nearly 2 miles away from the dusty quarters where the day laborers lived and worked. Because of this vast distance and his preference for solitude, most of the hired hands had never actually seen the face of the man who signed their paychecks. They knew his name, spoken with a mixture of profound respect and a certain underlying fear. But to those who spent their days toiling in the sun, Arthur Nelson was a ghost, a myth of power and wealth. The daily operations were left in the hands of David, a formidable foreman of 50 years with a barrel chest, a voice like grinding gravel, and a harsh demeanor that made the strongest men bow their heads the moment they heard his heavy boots thumping against the dry earth. David ruled the ranch with a clenched fist and a constantly open ledger, meticulously noting every mistake and distributing punishments with cold efficiency and controlling every ounce of grain and every tool that moved through the storehouses. Arthur had trusted him out of habit, a loyalty inherited from his father's era. But lately a persistent unease had begun to gnaw at Arthur's conscience. The accounts were beginning to look fractured, supplies were vanishing into thin air, and the whispers reaching the main house about the brutal treatment of the workers were becoming increasingly dark and impossible to ignore. However, it was not just the management of the ranch that kept Arthur awake during the long, silent Montana nights. His older brother, George, was pressuring him relentlessly to accept a marriage proposal to Catherine, the daughter of Elliot Flowers. She's a powerful neighboring rancher whose political influence and vast landholdings would essentially double the Nelson family fortune. George was the official administrator of the estate's legal affairs, a man of paper, contracts, and calculated alliances. And to him this marriage was a simple matter of mathematics and survival. Catherine was undeniably beautiful, educated in the refined schools of the East Coast, a woman who could play the piano with grace and speak fluent French in a way that charmed every socialite in the territory. Any other man in the valley would have jumped at the chance to wed such a woman without a second thought. But Arthur was not just any man, and he carried a jagged wound in his heart that refused to heal. 2 years prior, Arthur had been engaged to a woman named Alice, the daughter of a wealthy merchant from a distant county. The wedding had been fully planned, the invitations were mailed, and the entire region was prepared for the grandest celebration of the decade, until one fateful evening when Arthur arrived early at his future father-in-law's home. He had entered through the back parlor, moving with the quiet familiarity of a man who was already part of the family, when he overheard Alice speaking with her older sister in the hallway. Her words had struck him like a physical blow, making the very ground beneath his feet feel as though it were vanishing into a void. Alice had called him a brute without refinement, claiming she would only endure the marriage until she could legally transfer a significant portion of his lands into her own name, after which she planned to live the life she truly desired, far away from a man who smelled of damp earth and calloused hands. Arthur did not say a word that night. He slipped away as silently as he had arrived, mounted his horse, and rode until the sun broke over the horizon. The next day, he broke the engagement publicly without offering a single detail of the betrayal, and the scandal tore through the valley like a wildfire in a dry forest. Alice and her family spread rumors that Arthur was unstable, paranoid, and incapable of keeping a woman's affection, and he let them talk because the agony of the betrayal left him with no breath to defend himself. Since that day, Arthur had locked his heart as firmly as he locked the heavy iron gates of his property. Convinced that no woman would ever see him for who he truly was, he believed that any woman who looked at him would only see the thousands of acres, the prize cattle, and the gold in his bank account. It was in this state of deep cynicism that George presented the latest demand for the union with Catherine. Arthur refused once, twice, and a third time until George finally lost his patience, shouting that Arthur would end up dying alone, a bitter old man surrounded by nothing but cattle and dirt, with no one to carry on the family name. Arthur listened in silence, but the words circled his mind for days like hungry hawks. One sleepless dawn, an idea was born from his desperation. He would not marry Catherine, nor would he accept any arranged match. Instead, he would do the unthinkable. He would go down to the workers' quarters, dress in the tattered rags of a common laborer, use a false name, and live among the very people who toiled on his land. If there was a woman in this world capable of loving a man who had nothing to offer but his own soul, he would find her there in the dust of the fields, far away from the polished ballrooms and silk dresses of the elite. George thought his brother had finally lost his sanity, calling it a madness and a needless humiliation. But when he realized Arthur would not be moved, he agreed to keep the secret. George would manage the formal business, telling anyone who asked that Arthur had traveled to another state to handle urgent cattle trades. The only other person who knew the truth was Grace, the ranch's longtime cook, who had practically raised the two brothers after their mother passed away from a fever during their childhood. Grace wept and prayed, calling Arthur a stubborn fool. But eventually she did as he asked, gathering the oldest, most worn-out clothes from the storage shed and blessing him at the back door of the main house on a quiet Friday afternoon. Arthur descended the winding dirt trail on foot, the path that connected the luxury of the main house to the humble dwellings of the ranch hands. He carried nothing but a small canvas satchel on his back and a letter of recommendation in his pocket, which George had written in a disguised hand, recommending a man named Michael for manual labor in the vegetable fields. As he approached the workers' area, the sun was beginning to dip below the jagged mountain peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and deep purple that spilled over the rows of crops and the whitewashed walls of the communal kitchen. Arthur had seen this place many times from the high windows of his study, but standing there on the ground, smelling the scent of turned earth mixed with stale coffee and human sweat, was a jarringly different experience. David was sitting on a heavy wooden bench near the tool shed when he saw the stranger approaching, and he evaluated the newcomer with a cold, predatory gaze that measured men only by the profit they could generate. He read the letter with minimal interest and pointed toward a row of rusty hoes leaning against the wall, telling Michael in a dry, dismissive voice that work started at 4 in the morning in the northern fields. He was told to sleep in the men's bunkhouse, eat what was provided in the mess hall, and above all, to never cause trouble. Arthur nodded in silence, keeping his eyes cast toward the dirt and playing the role of a humble man desperate for a job to survive. Inside, however, his eyes were wide open, recording every detail of the place that belonged to him by law, realizing in that very instant that he knew far less about his own kingdom than he had ever cared to admit. That first night, lying on a thin canvas cot stretched between two wooden stakes, Arthur listened to the other workers whispering in the dark before sleep took them. They spoke of David with a mixture of simmering rage and weary resignation, complaining about the food that seemed to get thinner every week, and the blankets that were missing from the supply room, despite the fact that the owners supposedly ordered new ones every winter. Among the murmurs, one name surfaced more than once, always accompanied by either a cruel laugh or a heavy, meaningful silence: Lillian. She was the daughter of a former driver, a girl who had arrived only recently, and the rumors said she carried the blood of a thief in her veins. They claimed she had brought bad luck to the ranch, and that David only kept her on because he couldn't find anyone else willing to work as hard for such miserable pay. Arthur remained silent, listening intently, and etched that name into his memory, unaware that it would soon become the center of his entire world. The first day of work began long before the sun dared to show itself, signaled by the loud clanging of a metal bar against a wooden post, David's preferred method for dragging the men from their beds. The darkness still held the valley when the workers filed out toward the fields carrying buckets and baskets, and Arthur followed them, feeling the crushing weight of a life he had never truly tasted. He had always known his workers woke early. He had always known the labor was grueling, but knowing a thing and feeling the ache of it in your own bones are two vastly different realities. As the sun rose and began to bake the dark Montana soil, Arthur's hands began to sting, and his back began to protest with every movement. It was in the middle of the morning that he saw her for the first time. She was kneeling between two rows of plants, sorting vegetables with a speed and precision that showed years of practiced attention. She looked to be about 25 years old, wearing a simple dress of coarse, unbleached fabric that had been faded by the sun and repeated washings, with a scarf tied tightly around her head to protect her from the heat. Her skin was bronzed from a life spent outdoors, and her arms were thin but firm, showing the strength of someone who knew the reality of hard labor. When she looked up for a brief moment to wipe the sweat from her brow, Arthur saw eyes of a deep, warm brown that carried an ancient sadness and a quiet dignity that hit him like a physical blow to the chest. It was Lillian. He knew it without anyone having to tell him, because around her there was a visible void that the other workers maintained on purpose, as if her loneliness were an invisible fence that they all respected, except for her. David rode through the fields on his horse later that morning, inspecting the progress with a sneer. When he reached the row where Lillian was working, he stopped the animal and stared down at her for a time that was far too long to be mere supervision. He then shouted for everyone to hear that her sorting was sloppy, claiming she was mixing spoiled produce with the good harvest, and he declared he would dock her rations for the entire week as punishment. Lillian did not lift her head, nor did she utter a single word of defense. She simply continued her work with the same precise, careful movements, while the foreman rode away laughing. Arthur, standing only a few yards away, felt the blood rush to his face in a surge of protective fury. He looked at Lillian's baskets and saw that her work was flawless, far better than any other worker in that field. David had lied in front of everyone, and not a single soul had dared to speak up. The midday sun was merciless, and Arthur, unaccustomed to this level of continuous physical strain, felt his vision dim, and his legs began to buckle beneath him. He leaned heavily on his hoe, gasping for air, but the heat was a solid wall pushing him toward the ground. The other workers passed him by without stopping, some casting looks of indifference, while others simply pretended not to see his struggle. No one offered a hand, and then a tin cup filled with cool water appeared before his eyes. Arthur lifted his head and found Lillian standing beside him, holding the cup out with an expression that wasn't pity or obligation, but something he had long ago forgotten how to recognize. It was simple, unadulterated kindness. He accepted the water and drank slowly while she waited, and when he handed the cup back, their eyes met in a moment that lasted much longer than it should have. She gave a small, solemn nod, tucked the cup into her apron pocket, and returned to her work without saying a word. Arthur stood there with the taste of that simple water in his mouth and a strange sensation in his chest, as if something that had been dormant for years had just opened its eyes. What Arthur did not yet know was that Lillian carried a secret about her past that was directly linked to the very foundation of his ranch. And what Lillian could not imagine was that the man to whom she had just offered water was the master of every inch of earth she walked upon. But fate, when it decides to cross two paths, does not ask for permission. The weeks that followed changed Arthur in ways he could never have predicted. The manual labor punished his body in a new and humbling way. For a man used to giving orders from behind a mahogany desk, his hands, which once held fine leather reins and gold-nibbed pens, were now covered in thick calluses and raw cuts that burned every time he gripped his tools. He woke before the light with agony in his shoulders, ate the same thin bean broth and hard-dried meat as the other men, and slept on a canvas cot, listening to the snores and coughs of his companions, wondering every night how these people endured this for an entire lifetime without losing their minds. But what bothered Arthur most wasn't the exhaustion or the meager food. It was realizing how blind he had been to the reality of his own land. David was running the ranch like his own private tyrannical kingdom. Arthur noticed it in the small details. The meat that was supposed to be delivered weekly to the workers only appeared every 15 days, and always in smaller quantities than Arthur knew he had authorized. The new blankets he sent every winter never reached the bunks, leaving the men to shiver under tattered, patched rags. The tools were old and poorly maintained, even though Arthur had approved the funds for replacements months ago. Every discovery was like a hot coal in his chest, but he forced himself to swallow his rage and record everything in his memory, knowing he needed ironclad proof to topple a man who had commanded this place for over a decade. Lillian remained David's favorite target for cruelty. Not a day went by without the foreman finding some excuse to humiliate her. If it rained and the crops were soaked, it was Lillian's fault for not covering them fast enough. If the sun scorched the leaves, it was because she hadn't watered them enough. Arthur began to understand that this persecution wasn't just random cruelty, it was calculated. David needed a permanent scapegoat, someone everyone already distrusted because of the story of her father, someone without friends or a voice to fight back. Lillian was perfect for this role, and the foreman used her with the coldness of a man moving a pawn on a board. Yet there was one exception to the wall of silence surrounding her, an old worker named Samuel. Samuel was over 70 years old, with white hair and massive gnarled hands, and he had lived on the ranch since Arthur's father's time. He was a man of few words, but he had a way of protecting Lillian that was subtle and constant, such as saving a spot for her on the mess hall bench or leaving his water jug near her when the sun was at its peak. Arthur noticed this discreet protection and came to respect the old man before they ever exchanged a word. It was Samuel who one night as they sat outside the bunkhouse whispered that Lillian was the daughter of Thomas the driver. Arthur felt a jolt in his memory. He knew that name from somewhere, an old ledger, a conversation with George, or a legal document. The memory wasn't complete, but it nagged at him like a splinter under the skin. Lillian had spent 2 years wandering from one ranch to another, being dismissed the moment someone discovered who her father was, until David finally accepted her at the Silver Pine Ranch for wages so low they were practically non-existent. The workers said David only kept her because he enjoyed having someone to step on, and Lillian endured it because she had nowhere else to go in the world. Arthur began to approach Lillian slowly with the caution one uses when approaching a wounded animal that has learned to fear any extended hand. In the beginning, she barely looked at him, answering his attempts at conversation with short, one-word replies. But Arthur did not give up. He started with small gestures, the same ones she had shown him. When he saw her carrying baskets that were too heavy, he would appear at her side and take one without asking. When David screamed at her, Arthur was the only one who didn't look away or laugh. He stood his ground, staring firmly at the foreman with a silent intensity that Lillian began to notice when their first real conversation happened at the edge of the creek behind the property where the workers washed their clothes on Sundays. They sat in silence for a long time, just the two of them and the sound of the rushing water, until Lillian asked where he came from. Arthur told a carefully crafted version of the truth, saying he had lost his family's land due to a bad business deal and was starting over from nothing. Lillian listened without interruption and simply said she knew what it felt like to lose everything and have to keep walking anyway. There was no pity in her voice, only the quiet recognition between two souls who knew the weight of sorrow. From that Sunday on, the meetings at the creek became a silent habit. Every week, without a formal agreement, they appeared there at the same time and washed their clothes side by side, talking slowly about small things that eventually revealed much larger truths. Lillian told him about her father, Thomas, who had been the best driver in the territory, an honorable man who knew every trail and treated his horses with more kindness than most men treated their families. She told him her father had never stolen a thing in his life, that the accusation of cattle rustling was a lie from start to finish, and she knew this with the certainty of someone who had seen his character every day for years. Her voice didn't shake with anger when she spoke. It trembled with a sadness so deep it seemed to have roots inside her soul. Arthur listened with double the attention, and the name Thomas the driver continued to prick at his mind. One night, while the others slept, he scoured his memories until the truth finally arrived like a slow tide reaching the shore. There had been a document in George's office, an old contract for cattle transport signed by a rancher named Elliot Flowers, the very man who wanted Arthur to marry his daughter. Arthur couldn't remember the details, but he knew Thomas's name was on it, and he knew David had worked for Elliot before coming to the Nelson Ranch. The coincidence was too great to be ignored, but he didn't have all the pieces yet, only the edges of a puzzle that troubled him more each day. As the undercover rancher gathered clues, the bond between him and Lillian grew with the quiet inevitability of true things. There were no grand declarations, only her hand straightening his collar when she noticed it was folded wrong, or his way of always saving the best piece of fruit to leave at the edge of the row where she worked. There were looks that lasted a second longer than necessary, and said things neither of them had the courage to put into words. Above all, there was the precious discovery that there was someone in the world who understood them without needing an explanation. One afternoon, Arthur saw Lillian leave the fields early and walk toward the pasture where the older retired horses were kept. He followed at a distance and found her kneeling beside an old mare that the other workers had abandoned because she was sick and limped on a back leg. Lillian was cleaning the animal's hoof with a damp cloth, speaking softly as if to a friend, applying a mixture of herbs with infinite patience. The horse, which shied away from everyone else, stood perfectly still under her touch. Arthur watched from behind a tree and felt something break in his chest, not from sadness but from pure admiration. This woman who had nothing spent her little free time caring for an animal no one wanted. She didn't do it to be seen. She did it because that was who she was. In that moment, Arthur knew he was no longer just curious. He was falling in love with Lillian in a way he hadn't felt since before Alice destroyed his ability to trust. But this rising feeling brought a terrible weight. He was lying to her every single day. Every time she called him Michael, every time she believed he was just another wandering hand, he was building their bond on a false foundation. The question that kept him awake was always the same. When she found out the truth, would she forgive him, or would she see him as just another powerful man playing with people's lives? On a blistering Tuesday when the air felt like it was on fire, David called all the workers to the yard after dinner. His face was flushed and his small eyes were gleaming with a malice the men knew and feared. He announced that a head of cattle had vanished from the northern pasture, claiming someone was stealing from the ranch, and that he would find the thief, even if he had to search every corner of the property. His eyes swept across the faces of the workers until they landed on Lillian, who stood at the back of the group, alone as always. He didn't accuse her directly that night, but the look he gave her said everything. The others understood the message, and the next day Lillian's isolation worsened. Some even muttered loudly enough for her to hear that a thief's daughter doesn't fall far from the tree. Arthur watched with a cold, focused fury. He knew Lillian hadn't stolen anything. He knew by the logic of the missing supplies and the doctored books that the real thief was David. But proving it required more than intuition. He needed numbers and records. That opportunity arrived sooner than he expected. That very night, Arthur saw David leaving the storehouse with a heavy sack on his back, meeting a rider at the back fence under the cover of darkness. There was a quick exchange, the sack for something David tucked into his pocket, and the rider vanished. Arthur burned every detail into his memory, knowing he had finally seen the crime with his own eyes. But David's next move would make everything much more urgent. The following week, David dropped the mask of the foreman and showed a side of himself that Lillian never expected to face alone. Arthur had been keeping a silent vigil, sleeping outside the bunkhouse to watch over the women's quarters. He had seen David prowling the area at night, testing doors and peering through cracks, waiting for a moment when Lillian was vulnerable. The exhaustion of labor and the sleepless nights were taking a toll on Arthur. He was growing thinner and paler, a fact that did not escape Lillian's notice. During their Sunday meeting at the creek, she stopped washing and looked at him with a directness that caught him off guard, saying he looked ill and offering her help if he were in any kind of trouble. Her voice was steady and sincere, the offer of someone who knew the weight of carrying burdens alone. Arthur felt a lump in his throat so tight he couldn't speak. He looked at this woman whom the world treated as trash, who still found the generosity to worry about him, and he knew he didn't deserve her kindness while he was still lying. He opened his mouth to tell her everything, but the sound of breaking branches on the trail interrupted them. It was a worker named Daisy running toward them, shouting that David was calling everyone to the yard immediately, and that anyone who didn't show up in 5 minutes would be fired on the spot. When they reached the yard, the workers were already gathered in a semicircle in front of the warehouse. David stood in the center, his face red with a calculated rage, and beside him were 3 torn sacks of expensive grain spilling onto the dirt. He waited until everyone was present and then pointed his finger directly at Lillian, his voice booming with the intent to humiliate. He claimed he had found the sacks hidden behind the women's bunkhouse and that the owner would surely call the sheriff to haul the thief's daughter away to the same fate as her father. The silence that followed was so thick Arthur could feel its weight. Not a soul moved as the workers looked at the ground or their boots, too afraid to take a side against the man who controlled their survival. Lillian stood in the middle of that cowardly silence, her hands still damp from the creek, her eyes wide with the realization that the truth didn't matter when everyone had already decided she was guilty. Arthur stepped forward, his body moving before his reason could stop it. He was driven by an indignation that could no longer be contained. He spoke with a voice that was no longer the humble tone of Michael. It was firm and commanding. He told the crowd that Lillian hadn't stolen a thing. And then he turned his eyes on David, asking the foreman to explain why he had been meeting riders at the back fence in the middle of the night to hand over sacks of supplies. The entire yard held its breath. David hesitated for only a second before losing his temper, calling Michael a liar and a vagabond, accusing him of being Lillian's accomplice. He announced that both would be kicked off the ranch that very night and grabbed Arthur by the collar, shoving him hard enough to make him stumble and fall onto the spilled grain. Lillian screamed and tried to get between them, but David grabbed her arm with a violence that made her gasp in pain, pulling her close and growling a threat into her ear. Arthur stood up from the dirt with a calmness that was terrifying, wiping a streak of blood from a cut on his forehead. He looked at David, not with the eyes of a drifter, but with the eyes of a man who had made a final decision. He looked at Lillian's terrified face and then at the silent workers, the people who lived on his land and ate his food without ever knowing his name. He took a deep breath and knew the moment had arrived. He reached inside his tattered shirt and pulled out a heavy gold signet ring on a leather cord. The ring of the Nelson family, engraved with the initials and a mark of authority recognized by every bank and lawman in the state, and he held the ring high where the setting sun could catch the gold and spoke his full name, Arthur Nelson, owner of the Silver Pine Ranch. He declared that he had lived among them as a worker to see the truth that the walls of his house had hidden from him. He turned to David and with a controlled fury that made his voice tremble, stripped him of his position immediately, stating that David would answer for every stolen sack of grain, every missing head of cattle, and every act of cruelty he had inflicted on those who couldn't defend themselves. David stumbled back as if he had been struck, the color draining from his face as his empire of lies collapsed. He tried to stammer out an excuse, but the words were a jumbled mess. The workers erupted into murmurs of shock and disbelief, their eyes darting between the ring and the man they thought was just another laborer. Samuel from the back of the group simply nodded as if he had suspected the truth all along. But Arthur's eyes were only on Lillian, and what he saw there hurt more than any blow. She was looking at him with an expression of profound disappointment, the look of someone who realized the only person she trusted was also wearing a mask. Lillian didn't say a word. She pulled herself away from David's now weak grip and walked away from the yard with steps that were firm on the outside but broken within. Arthur tried to follow, but David attempted to flee, and the chaos that erupted required Arthur's immediate attention to ensure the criminal didn't escape. George arrived less than an hour later, summoned by a messenger, and took charge of the legal mess while Arthur searched for Lillian. She wasn't in the bunkhouse or by the creek. It was Samuel who finally told Arthur that she had likely gone to the only place she felt at peace, a massive old oak tree on the eastern ridge where she went when the world became too heavy. Arthur climbed the hill in the dark, guided by the moon, and found her sitting among the roots, her face wet with tears. He stopped a few paces away, the silence between them now filled with the weight of hidden truths. He sat on the ground near her and began to talk, not as a master, but as the man she had known in the fields. He told her about Alice's betrayal, about the pressure to marry for money, and about his fear that he would never find anyone who loved him for himself. He confessed that the disguise was born of desperation, but not for sport, and that he never expected to find someone like her. He admitted that he should have told her the truth at the creek, and that his fear of losing her had outweighed his courage to be honest. He placed his signet ring on the ground between them, saying it represented who he was on the outside, but that she already knew who he was in his heart. He then turned and walked away, giving her the space to decide her own future. That night, Arthur sat in the small communal kitchen, reading through the documents found in David's room. Among the ledgers and receipts, he found a letter from Elliot Flowers written 3 years ago, instructing David to frame a driver named Thomas for cattle rustling. Thomas had discovered that Elliot was using the transport routes to move stolen livestock and to silence him, but Elliot had bought off witnesses and a local deputy to send an innocent man to prison. Arthur realized with a sickening jolt that Lillian's father had been a hero, not a thief, and that the man who destroyed him was the same man trying to force Arthur into a marriage with his daughter. Arthur spent the rest of the night documenting the evidence, vowing to clear Thomas's name and make Elliot pay for every tear Lillian and her mother had shed. As dawn began to break, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Lillian holding the signet ring in her hand. She sat beside him and said she had spent the night thinking about every conversation they had shared. She told him that despite the lie of his name, she couldn't find a lie in the man who had shared his water, carried her baskets, and stood watch over her at night. She chose to believe in that man because if she let the fear of being deceived destroy the only good thing in her life, then the villains of the world would truly win. In the weeks that followed, Arthur cleared Thomas's name officially, publishing the truth in every newspaper in the territory and ensuring Elliot Flowers was brought to justice. The Silver Pine Ranch was transformed. Arthur replaced David with a fair foreman, improved the living conditions, and raised the wages of every worker. Lillian moved into the main house, not as a servant, but as the partner Arthur had never dared to hope for. Their wedding was a simple affair in the small valley chapel, attended by every worker on the ranch, with Samuel as a guest of honor, and Grace weeping with joy in the front row. A year later, a son was born to them, and they named him Thomas, ensuring that a name once dragged through the dirt would now be carried with honor and love. As Arthur looked at his wife and child from the porch of their home, he realized that the greatest wealth he possessed wasn't the land or the cattle, but the truth they had found in the dust of the fields. Life has a way of stripping us down to our barest elements, much like the wind that carves the mountains of Montana. And in those moments of vulnerability, we discover what is truly durable. We often spend our youth chasing shadows, wealth, status, and the hollow approval of those who only love the version of us that fits their needs. But as the hair turns silver and the steps grow slower, the soul begins to understand that the only currency that matters at the end of the day is the weight of the kindness we gave when no one was looking. But to live a long life is to learn that everyone wears a mask of some kind. Sometimes out of malice, but more often out of a deep-seated fear of being rejected for our flaws. The challenge of a meaningful existence isn't to never be deceived, but to keep the heart soft enough to forgive when the truth finally comes to light. Arthur Nelson had to lose his identity to find his soul, and Lillian had to lose her pride to find a love that could heal her past. This is the great human lesson that we are all, in a sense, laborers in a vast field, searching for a drop of water in the heat of the day. When we find someone willing to share their cup, we must hold on to them with everything we have. For such connections are the only things that remain when the sun sets on our time here. True humanity is not found in the absence of mistakes, but in the courage to make things right. It is easy to judge the world from the safety of a high window, but it is only when we walk in the dirt of the common path that we see the inherent worth of every human being. The elderly among us know this best. They know that the houses we build will eventually crumble and the gold we hoard will lose its luster. But the memory of a hand held in the dark and a name cleared of injustice will echo through generations. We must learn to see beyond the tattered clothes and the reputations assigned by a cruel society. For within the most discarded among us often beats the most noble of hearts. Let us walk through our own lives with the humility of a man who knows he is no better than his neighbor and the strength of a woman who refuses to let bitterness take root in her garden. For in the end, we are all just travelers looking for a place where we are known, where we are seen, and where we are loved for nothing more than the simple fact that we exist and that we tried our best to be kind.